This is the End of the Road podcast with your host, Michael Coco. Exploring the horizons we never touch because we're already there.
Welcome. And thanks for listening. Tonight we're off to Washington, D.C. with Hari-Kirtana Das. We're discussing the Bhagavad Gita and specifically his new book called Journey into the Bhagavad Gita, a guide to exploring timeless principles of transcendental knowledge and integrating them into your life. And what's great about this book is it really is a journey into the Bhagavad Gita. Because as Hari wonderfully describes, the worldview in the book is so much different than the world that we find ourselves in. And indeed, much about the book is exploding the parameters of the modern world, which allows us to really connect with this ancient and profound teaching. So let's jump right into the chariot next to Krishna and let Hari take us away.
The dialogue of the Bhagavad Gita is one of the most inspirational and challenging conversations in the history of literature. And one reason that the Bhagavad Gita may be challenging for a contemporary Western audience, even those who are interested in spirituality and the union of theology and philosophy, is that its worldview is very, very different from that of a modern worldview and that of most traditional monotheistic religions. So to understand and appreciate the value of the Gita's worldview, the reader has to become familiar with a new set of philosophical ideas. And by becoming familiar with these new ideas, one develops the ability to look at the world through the lens that the Gita gives us, rather than looking at the Gita through the lens that the world gives us.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. We all could use a little bit of that. The alternative to cell phones and TVs and Facebook and Instagram and TikTok. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the modern world tells us how to look at historical texts. And when we look at a spiritual philosophy as it's presented in the historical text of the Bhagavad Gita through the historical lens that the world offers us, what we see is what that lens is capable of showing us. And we are confined by this historical consciousness to the parameters of the modern world. And the philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita pretty much explodes those parameters. But you won't see that if you stay within the restricted space of a modern worldview. There has to be a leap of reasonable faith into the world of the Bhagavad Gita so you can turn around and look at our world through the lens that the Bhagavad Gita gives us, so we can see what the Bhagavad Gita sees, because that's where the real transformational power of the Bhagavad Gita lies, in its ability to show us that which we cannot see from where we're currently situated.
So the first act, so to speak, is on a battlefield, on a chariot with God, or is that the archetype, the metaphor, the situation?
Yes, we are meant to follow in Arjuna's footsteps. So when Krishna is speaking from the position of the supreme being to Arjuna, we should be taking Arjuna's seat. And we should be looking at how does Arjuna respond to Krishna. And if we follow Arjuna's example of how he receives and uses his capacity for critical thinking to question what he is receiving in a way that is meant to learn more rather than to challenge based on some preconceived idea. Then we can replicate Arjuna's experience of self-realization. This is one of the most important features of a spiritual wisdom text, which I call the illuminative function. The spiritual wisdom texts provide us with the tools that we need in order to replicate the revelatory experience of the author.
Who do we know who the author was?
We don't. The traditional understanding is that the Bhagavad Gita is spoken about 5,000 years ago, just prior to the beginning of the Kali Yuga. The Puranic sense of time is cyclical. There are 4 seasons of time, just as there are 4 seasons that we experience in every year. And this particular season of time, Kali Yuga, known as the Iron Age of quarrel and hypocrisy, is about to begin, just as the Gita is spoken. And of course, this is either ahistorical or prehistorical or transhistorical. Pick one. I think it could be all 3. It is extremely difficult to pinpoint anything that goes on the Indian subcontinent in times prior to the Persian invasions. The people living in the area around the Indus River Valley and the rest of the Indian subcontinent were not particularly interested in historical record keeping, which is why scholars can pinpoint the destruction of the Second Temple of Jerusalem within 6 months, whereas where Patanjali, the author of the Yoga Sutras, is concerned, they can't figure out where he showed up within 1,000 years, or even if there was such a person. Maybe it was a title that lots of people had. They just don't know. So when it comes to the historicity of the Vedic tradition prior to the early Middle Ages, it gets really, really difficult. And so my book does not deal with the historicity of the Bhagavad Gita. I am more focused on how you relate to the message and the messenger.
Well, should we get to the Gita now?
Sure.
And I noticed, before we get to the 5 the 5 lessons that your book highlights, I sort of was taken by sort of the preface of the book that talks about that happiness and alignment in the world is not changing the world, but aligning us to the changing nature of reality, as sort of like a meta-narrative going on in the Gita.
Yes. Usually, our conception of happiness is based on moving the world into alignment with our desires. And of course, the world is really big, and we are very small. So it's a very difficult thing to try to move the world into alignment with our desires. And it's really beyond our control. Every so often it happens. Everything just lines up perfectly, and then we're happy for the moment in which that alignment occurs. And then it starts to move out of alignment again, and we have to make a great effort to try to move it back. And that's not really sustainable. What is sustainable is learning how the universe works in the sense of what is changeless about the universe. What is the center of the universe around which everything is revolving? Now, how can I position myself so that I am aligning with the nature of reality rather than trying to get reality to align with my desires. And actual sustainable happiness arises when we think more in terms of how can I revolve around the center rather than how can I be the center around which everything revolves.
Right. Well, one way obviously is when you have God as your co-pilot on the chariot.
That
Literally,
is,
I mean, what a great narrative to achieve that when literally, I mean, that's kind of the story, and then you're fighting like a huge battle, which at one level is a huge battle, but on another level, I think you would agree is just everyday existence and the struggles that we deal with every day at all levels.
yes, the fact that the Bhagavad Gita is spoken in the middle of a battlefield just as a great battle is about to be fought is significant. And certainly we all have our own inner battles, our own outer battles. And the Gita is, in one major respect, meant to be a guidebook for preparing to go into battle. It's also worth noting that the Gita's instructions are specific to a circumstance of an imminent battle. And Krishna, throughout the Bhagavad Gita, is advising his friend, the warrior Arjuna, that fighting is the right thing to do. However, it's not always the right thing to do. In this particular circumstance, it's the right thing to do. And Krishna gives his reasoning as to why it's the right thing to do throughout the rest of the Gita. So it's an argument in favor of fighting. But the more essential underlying instruction that's so important that it is one of the two instructions that Krishna repeats almost verbatim, is that it is better to do what we were born to do rather than trying to do something that is more suitable for someone else. Even if we perform our own, what is often called prescribed duty, what we are meant to do in the world, even if we do that imperfectly, it's still better than trying to do something that's meant for other people to do. So, taking the Gita's instructions from the standpoint of, first of all, how does it help me understand what was I meant to do? It's almost like Barbie. What was I made for? What is my purpose in the world? What should I be doing to give meaning and purpose to my life and make a contribution to the world at the same time? And how am I going to do that in a way that brings me satisfaction and makes a meaningful contribution? That's the underlying instruction. And whether it's fighting or doing something else at any given point in time, that may change. That's actually a variable. It's not as if we should always be fighting everywhere all the time. It's not a universal trans-contextual instruction, but it's something that in this case points in the direction of something that is eternal, universal, and trans-contextual.
Right, right. So I just can't. I'm just sort of. I have this image though of him in a chariot with Krishna, or like
Mm-hmm.
God literally in a chariot with you, and then the image of the chariot. And, I'm thinking, all sorts of and I know the Gita, of course, is an Eastern tradition, but I can't help thinking of sort of Western esoteric things coming up, like the idea of a diamond, perhaps, about, because he's literally like a voice in his head at the same time, and literally God is, no separation, riding the chariot, driving the chariot with you. And there seems to be, almost, like it's parallels to maybe Greek mythology as well. But is there a difference? Is this relationship, it seems to be, extremely intimate as well. Beyond sort of what you talked before about separation. I was just wondering if there's a difference between sort of more Western views of diamonds or gods and sort of what's going on here.
There are both similarities and significant differences. There are unique theological propositions in the Bhagavad Gita. You can find many things in the Gita that you'll find elsewhere, including in Western mythology and theology and philosophy. There are some things that make the Gita unique among spiritual wisdom texts. One of the things that makes the Gita unique is how Krishna is a person with a distinct personality and with a distinct form, who is standing before Arjuna, speaking to him, and the words are coming out of his mouth and going into Arjuna's ears. And he speaks of himself, Krishna speaks of himself as the source of everything itself, someone who is beyond everything, and who is locally situated within the heart of all beings. And in many cases, one of the things that makes the Gita a little bit challenging is that Krishna will speak of himself in the third person. In most of the instances where he speaks about his role as Ishvara, as the Lord of all beings, who is situated within the heart of all beings. But every so often he will say, oh, and by the way, that's me. I am this Param Atma, this paramount Atma, the super soul within all souls. So you get this kind of multi-level conception of a supreme being as the source of everything, the essence of everything, a person who is universal consciousness, locally situated within the heart of all beings, and a unique personality or a unique being unto himself. And I'll use the gendered descriptive in this case because Krishna is manifesting a male form. But in my book, I also speak about the feminine aspect of divinity within Krishna and how they are both simultaneously one and different aspects of divinity. And this proximity, this intimacy of relationship is facilitated by the personal form of Krishna. And this element of personalism, of a form or an aspect, a feature of divinity, wherein beauty and charm and love predominate over majesty and power, what we usually associate with God. The idea that we worship God, fear God sometimes, that there is awe and reverence is the appropriate way to approach God. And here we have a feature of God that says, yeah, there's that, but I'm inviting you to engage with me on a different level, on a more intimate level, on a level where you can just hang out with me as your friend in the safest of all possible spaces, namely my own personal spiritual atmosphere. And I think that that is somewhat unique in how the Bhagavad Gita presents the comprehensive idea of divinity that focuses on the personality of Godhead, that invites us to engage in an intimate, friendly relationship.
Yeah, and you also, I think, in the book emphasize the importance of. I'm probably paraphrasing here, of how you need to sort of live this truth rather than just read about it. And I think there's something about what you just said about, sort of the intimacy and the that God is both transcendent and right in front of you, and has their own personality, and it's just like it's an invitation to sort of go all in, perhaps, and have no separation between these theological discussions and the real world discussions, the battles that we actually have.
Mm-hmm.
Is there or how would you sort of point, or what I'm pointing at, how would you sort of describe that relationship?
You're right. The Gita is meant to be a lived experience, not just armchair philosophy. And to that end, one of the ways I structured my book was to facilitate, one of the reasons I structured my book the way I did was to facilitate the reader entering into the world of the Bhagavad Gita and then bringing the Bhagavad Gita into their own world, into the world of their life. So there's a first part of the book that explains what you need to know in order to enter the Gita's world. Then the second part of the book is the Gita itself, the Gita's world. And then the third part of the book is how to bring the Gita's world into your life in a very practical way. And so there are some examples I've given, short stories from my own life about how I have looked at myself and looked at the world through the lens that the Bhagavad Gita has provided, and how it's transformed my experience of myself and my experience of the world. And there are discussion jumping off points and exercises, personal experiments that you can do in order to take the Gita's teachings for a test drive and see, how can I use this for myself and for my engagement with the world? And that begins with some experiments in having a conversation with God. How would I go about having that conversation? And who would God need to be? What kind of person would God need to be in order for me to feel comfortable and safe having that kind of conversation wherein I really reveal the contents of my heart? Which means that you really have to have a conception of God that you can trust this person to be kind, to be generous, to be non-judgmental, to be a lot of things that those of us who grew up in and around Western monotheistic religions did not always have as a conception of God. Our conception of a supreme being determines the nature of our faith in a supreme being, or the absence of faith. So one of the things I've tried to emphasize in the book is this idea that the Bhagavad Gita presents us with a conception of divinity who really has our best interests at heart, who loves us unconditionally, and with whom we can feel safe in our revelation of the innermost contents of our hearts.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. Well, you mentioned going in and taking this on a test drive, or would you rather unpack the the five progressive, deeper secrets of the Gita first.
Well, we can talk a little bit more about the test drive. Yoga is a science. And this science has a theological element to it. And the fact that there is a theological element to the science of yoga does not kick it over into the realm of faith without reason. On the contrary, the Gita and the Vedic yoga wisdom tradition provides us with the means to ascertain whether or not we have a good reason to believe in something or someone. So this union of faith and knowledge that is also an element of the Bhagavad Gita that we certainly don't get in modern conceptions of philosophy or knowledge being in one realm and theology or religion being another realm. Knowledge is facts and what you know, and faith is what you believe in, whether it's based on anything real or not, it doesn't matter. These two things are merged together so that you get a spiritual science. And a science has a theory, and then it also has an experiment that you can use to test to see if the theory is valid. And then if you get the results that are predicted by performing the experiment according to the prescribed method, then you know that you can have reasonable faith that the propositions are true. So the third portion of my book, I specifically call part of the exercises personal experiments for precisely that reason, so that the reader can take it for a test drive, see if it works, see if you get the predicted results when you do the experiment, or if you get some kind of transformative result that adds value to your life.
Mm-hmm. And one of the experiments, I think, involved a young lady asking you a question. Hari, what do you really believe?
Yes,
and there's no more of a test drive than that, perhaps.
Yes, that story could also have been called "How I Met My Wife."
Exactly.
Yeah, and that was, of course, one of the most wonderful things that happened to me is that I was obliged, by virtue of my wife's integrity, to reassess the way I was living and bring myself back into alignment with what I really believed was ultimately true, and stop pretending that I didn't really have to pay attention to that while I pursued desires that really were external to that truth. So that was a very, very fortunate turning point in my life.
It's interesting that in the book you don't remember exactly what you said, but you remember sort of the effect of it, which I thought was sort of, I mean, a lot of life I think is that way. There's sort of like a guiding force beneath everything that's more important than sort of the trappings of the verbiage sometimes, or the concepts maybe.
Yeah. I really don't remember exactly how I responded. I don't know what words came out of my mouth, but I do know what the effect of the whole conversation was, and that, of course, was more important.
Yeah. So what about that conversation allowed you to sort of reframe, or I think you talked about, that there was a certain amount of pretending going on that sort of went away after that.
Yes, I had a lot of my life up to that point had unraveled materially and spiritually. I was in the throes, I guess, of what would commonly be called a midlife crisis. And in the middle of that crisis, I was really just pursuing material desires under the usual illusion that so many men experience at that stage of life, where they think, I missed out. I, I missed out on enjoying my life in this way or that way. And so that's kind of where I was at. And during that period of time, I met Elizabeth, and she gave me the reality check. She saw something beneath the surface that I was trying to ignore about myself. And it's just my good fortune that she sensed there was something there, and that she was interested enough to ask me a serious question. And now I had to acknowledge the integrity of her question and how I was misaligned personally with my own sense of truth. And that therefore I had to realign myself with what I ultimately believed was true in order to have any hope of being truly happy. And B, I needed to keep this woman in my life, which fortunately I managed to do.
Sure, sure. Is there any sort of analogy or resonance to almost, when the way the way you described that, and I just couldn't help thinking that she was like an aspect of Krishna on your chariot at that time, and there was a conversation going on. Is there any sort of, or am I being too literal there?
Perhaps. I see it more as Krishna's arrangement for me. Even though I was trying to put the relationship aside while I pursued the illusion of independence from Krishna, by some causeless mercy, you could call it, Krishna decided that he was not going to give up on me the way I was sort of hedging on my relationship, my side of the relationship with him. And so I view it that in order to reconnect me to him, Krishna sent Elizabeth to come and get me. And Elizabeth also had that same sense much later, that her meeting me was Krishna's arrangement for her to do more or less the same thing, even though she had not had the same previous experience with bhakti yoga that I had. In due course of time, she came to a lot of the reason the book is the way that it is because of her. She really gets a lot of credit, not only as my editor-in-chief to help me structure it and make sure that I was as succinct as I was comprehensive, but also in due course of time, she needed to know more about the philosophy that I was living by, or that I was once again situating myself in. And so she asked me questions about, what is this philosophy? What is the theology? How does this work? And so I would explain it. And, you can't teach something using the same language that was used to teach it to you. That really never works. But I didn't know any other language, so I would explain a philosophical idea to her, and she would say, wait, what does that mean? What is this phrase that you just used? Break that down. What does that mean? And so I would explain the phrase, and she would stop me halfway through my explanation and say, wait, what does that mean? What do you explain this phrase that you use to explain that phrase? And so I had to keep constantly stepping back, finding normal language to explain philosophical ideas, and that I'd never really explained in that way before. And in this way, she indirectly taught me how to teach this to people who had not had the same training inside a yoga ashram that I had had. And as a yoga teacher, trying to figure out how to introduce these ideas in little sound bites that were relatable to people coming to my classes, this was an indispensable training. So in many respects, the accessibility that I've given to the philosophical ideas of the Bhagavad Gita are a direct result of her interrogations that forced me to figure out how can I explain this in simple, relatable language. And hopefully I have succeeded in doing that in the first portion of my book.
Right, right. So is what Krishna is doing a similar interrogation, or was the dynamic a little bit different?
You mean between Krishna and Arjuna?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, is it, or what sort of was his teaching method? Perhaps maybe that's a different way to ask the question. And was it at all similar to what was going on with you? Because you were talking about, and I've had a similar person in my life. I haven't written a book, but somebody who just the same thing. Like, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? Like every sentence you write, ask yourself, what are you talking about there?
Yes,
And so,
I think you're onto something.
yeah.
There is sort of a parallel insofar as Arjuna, the Bhagavad Gita, the dialogue of the Gita, is being driven by Arjuna's questions. And the first question is really more of a request. Many of Arjuna's questions take the form of requests. And the first request is, I don't know what to do. You tell me what to do. And Krishna doesn't actually ever do that. He never says, I command you to do this. There are no commandments in the Bhagavad Gita. Nor does he really answer Arjuna's question in the beginning. That question is, how can everyone live happily ever after? Arjuna looks on the battlefield. He foresees the destruction that's to come. He thinks this is so unnecessary. There must be some other way, even though every diplomatic possibility has been exhausted to avoid fighting. He's thinking, no, there's got to be some way where we can all live happily ever after. Please tell me which course of action will give me that result. And Krishna responds by saying, you're not going to get that result. That's not going to happen. You can't avoid this. You need to move through it. Now I can help you move through it. And the first portion of the Gita, Arjuna is asking questions, and they're all doubt-based questions. He's saying, please, you can dispel my doubts. You can explain this. And there is this idea of, okay, well, you've told me this, but now you have to explain that aspect of it because I'm not getting this. And this goes on, this series of doubt-based questions continues throughout the first half of the Bhagavad Gita. Then there's a turning point. And Arjuna accepts what Krishna has advised him to do, but he's not ready to fight yet because he wants a further explanation. And so he circles back through the questions that he asked previously, requesting a more information, a greater elaboration, more of a complete explanation of these points. But now they are faith-based questions. He wants to understand how what Krishna has told him is true. And he eventually cycles back to his very first question beyond how can it be happily ever after, to make sure he understands the difference between the renunciation of action and the renunciation of the fruits of action. And once Arjuna has this explanation of the difference between letting go of acting altogether and acting without attachment to the results of action, then that's when he's ready to move forward and proceed according to Krishna's advice.
Yeah.
And so there was a similarity that, on the one hand, in the first conversation I had with Elizabeth, I had to act on the basis of her advice, and her question was, well, if that's what you really believe, then how can you live the way you're living? And so the implied advice was, I need to change the way I'm living so that it's in alignment with what I really believe. And then when the conversation went the other way, she began with doubts that I had to dispel by presenting her with a coherent, logical philosophy. And then there was a turning point, and then her questions became more faith-based questions of, okay, help me have a deeper understanding of how this philosophy and how this theology work together as a coherent system.
Right. So I like to push things to the end. Sometimes I push the metaphors or the analogies past the point of reckoning. But just like looking at your life now with you and Elizabeth, is there anything in that is resonant with sort of the Gita and sort of the message, or if I push the analogy too far, which of course I want to do?
No, actually, this is good. I am a big fan of pushing the envelope of just about anything, including metaphors. So much so that one boss that I had in my previous life, working for a big tech company, he said he understood my natural inclination to push envelopes. And so his advice was, push the envelope, just try not to break it.
Exactly.
So yes, I think now what you could say was, we changed roles relative to one another. Krishna spoke to me through her in the beginning. Krishna spoke to her through me in the second part of that conversation. And now the two of us are on the chariot that we are trusting Krishna to drive. So our role model is Arjuna. And we are doing our best to follow in Arjuna's footsteps by letting Krishna drive our chariot. And as long as we don't jump off the chariot, then I think we'll be okay.
Yeah. And so what about the narrative then, back to the Gita? How does it all end? Perhaps maybe that's the way, or I mean, that's probably too literal of a thing. But what's your take on sort of the energy of the ending?
Well, spoiler alert for anyone who has not yet read the Gita. Arjuna fights. He decides that Krishna's advice is sound. Throughout the Gita, Krishna says, this is my opinion. I'm God. You should take that into account when you consider my opinion, but it's my opinion. It's not my directive, and you should decide for yourself what the right thing to do is. And this is a wonderful confirmation of our free will, that everything is not all predestination, that there is karma, there is the law of reaction to actions, but it's not all set in stone henceforth and forevermore. So there's this combination of free will and predestination that we learn how to balance the tension of throughout our study of the Gita. And in terms of how it ends up, ultimately, Arjuna, the word is often surrender, but it is more in the feeling of the Gita that Arjuna accepts Krishna as his shelter. Sharanam is the Sanskrit word. Arjuna takes shelter of Krishna with reasonable faith that somehow or other things are going to work out, even if he doesn't see that the battle will be the best thing, he accepts Krishna's logic about how fighting is the right thing for him to do, not because of the result he's going to get, but because it's the right thing to do. So the big takeaway at the end is do the right thing because it's the right thing to do, not because of what you think you're going to gain from it.
Right. And is there a resonance in your life now about? I just there's something when I'm reading this is I just can't help feeling that like this battle is, even though it's it's like an epic archetypical battle, involving family and generations and everything. But there's something also. I mean, is it supposed to be a grand epic battle, or can it also be, like I was sort of alluding to before, sort of the commonplace day-to-day reality that we all face? Or am I off on the wrong track again?
The Bhagavad Gita and Vedic yoga philosophy in general is so often a both and situation.
Sure.
So yes, you have this super intense archetypal story, and you have our own inner battles that we are wrestling with. And then we have our own external challenges that we have to meet. And then, as of the moment of this recording, we have really big challenges that we are called to participate in, that we have a duty as a member of society to make a meaningful contribution to the cause that we believe in, or the cause that we depend on for our own livelihood or our own way of living or our freedom to be in the world and move through the world in accordance with what we believe is right. So it's something that we can see on multiple levels, on multiple scales. And in terms of metaphor, there is value to the symbolic meaning of the Gita, and there is also value in the literal understanding of the Gita, by which I mean the text means what it says. One of the rules of hermeneutics, the science of understanding scripture, is that a passage should be taken to just mean what it says. The self-evident meaning should be accepted unless a metaphor is required in order to make sense of it. So there is both, once again, both and. There is both value in a metaphorical understanding of the Gita insofar as how we integrate the Gita's teachings in our lives. And there's also value in a literal reading of the text, in the sense that there are instructions that don't require any interpretation or any philosophical overlay from some other school of thought. It just means exactly what it says, and those can be integrated into our lives just as readily as any symbolic meaning can be integrated into our lives.
Well, we talked before about the five secrets. Have we? Is there anything that you'd like to sort of set those apart, or should we just skip that part of what we?
No, we can talk about these five secrets. This is actually something that I did not specifically spell out in my book. It's something that I talk about in my course, but if you wrote everything you can write about the Bhagavad Gita, you'd write an encyclopedia. And I tried to keep things as succinct as possible. And in fact, when I first got the test copy back from the printer, I couldn't believe I'd written a book that took that many pages, even with the type being a little larger and the layout being spread out. I still thought it was a lot bigger than I expected it to be. I thought it was going to be much smaller. So I did not include what we're going to talk about now specifically in the book. And so hopefully for your listeners, this will add something of value to their reading of the Bhagavad Gita, whichever edition they happen to have.
Sure. Well, that sounds great. Would you want to start with the first secret then?
Sure. There are several different ways to understand this idea of 5 progressively deeper secrets in the Bhagavad Gita. And I will share the one I use as kind of the primary way of understanding these 5 secrets. And then, we can look at quickly at some of the other interpretations of this idea of 5 secrets. So the first secret is basic knowledge of the distinction between spirit and matter. This is the subject matter of Sankhya Yoga, or the yoga of discernment, the yoga of the delineation of elements. And the 2 most important elements that the aspiring yogi is encouraged to make a distinction between is the distinction between spirit and matter, or in other words, the idea that we are eternal spiritual beings inhabiting temporary material bodies. And this distinction between spirit and matter, this idea that we are not the material body, which includes the mind. It's an interesting aspect of yoga philosophy that the metaphysical aspect of ourselves, our psychology, our emotions, our intelligence, our ego, that's all in the category of matter. It's subtle matter, it's metaphysical matter, but it's still in the category of prakriti, or matter. So this distinction is just for regular folks who need to have this basic information in order to gain some freedom from material attachments. In other words, attachments associated with the mind and body. So that's the first secret.
And the second secret, and all of these are sort of like there's sort of like a progression in terms of, and again, I don't know the words. You sort of elaborated on this in the book. There's sort of like not necessarily a higher or lower, but sort of a more transcendent aspect to each one of these. Correct?
Yes.
As a progressively progressively levels of transcendence. Perhaps.
Yes.
Yeah.
They are the secrets themselves are progressive. They are described as a secret, then a confidential knowledge, then more confidential, then still more confidential, and then finally the most confidential knowledge. And there are Sanskrit words in the verses that literally say this is more confidential, guyatara, still more confidential, guyatama, sarva guyatama, most confidential. So they're specific. However, even though they are progressively deeper and deeper secrets, they don't show up in a linear fashion in the Bhagavad Gita, insofar as it's not systematically laid out the way, for example, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali are laid out, because it's a different literary form. Sutras, as opposed to shlokas. Sutras are codified instructions. Shlokas are poetic verses. So the way the literature itself works is different. So you can find this progression of secrets, but the verses that indicate the specifics of the secret are not necessarily going to show up in precisely the order that you might expect. So the second secret, or the way I present the second secret, is knowledge of Brahman, the spiritual substratum of existence, the unified spiritual context within which the differentiated material world exists. And the purpose of knowledge of Brahman, of the spiritual unity of everything, is for those who seek higher knowledge on spiritual topics, to understand the ultimate nature of existence. Then the third secret is knowledge of Paramatma, the paramount Atma, the ultimate soul, who is the one soul within the heart of all souls, all-pervading universal consciousness locally situated within the heart of each infinitesimal being, in other words, you and I. And the purpose of this secret is to provide an object of meditation for yogis who aspire for self-realization, and for everyone to know that the source of our being exists within us and is already guiding us, on whether we know it or not, but is available to us as a resource to proactively engage with in order to be guided to the best possible end goal that we could pursue. Then the fourth secret is knowledge of Bhagavan in his aspect of majesty and power. So Bhagavan means that person who possesses all divine attributes, who is blessed with all opulences. And this aspect of the personality of Godhead is that aspect that inspires awe and reverence, the power and majesty of God. And the purpose of this secret, or this level of knowledge, is to attract the minds of those who want to worship God from a safe distance. And then the fifth secret is knowledge of Bhagavan Sri Krishna in his aspect of beauty and grace. Every time Krishna speaks in the Bhagavad Gita, his speech is preceded by the phrase Shri Bhagavan Uvacha, so Uvacha vocalized. When Arjuna speaks, it's Arjuna Uvacha. When the narrator of the Bhagavad Gita, Sanjaya, speaks, it's Sanjaya Uvacha. But when Krishna speaks, it's Shri Bhagavan Uvacha, and it's not just Bhagavan, the personality of Godhead, but Shri, the beautiful personality of Godhead. And it is in this word Shri, which is also a name for the goddess of fortune, that we find the feminine aspect of divinity present in the Bhagavad Gita. And the understanding, at least in my lineage, is that the feminine aspect of divinity is the source of the beauty of the form of divinity, in much the same way that the core of the sun is the source of the sun's shine. You know, the beauty of the sun is in its shine, but its origin point is the core. So similarly, the feminine aspect of divinity and the masculine aspect of divinity are simultaneously one and yet different. And it is this Shri, this feminine aspect, that provides the beauty that shines off of the form of Bhagavan. And this aspect of divinity is the form of the Godhead that inspires devotion and invites intimacy. And its purpose is to attract the hearts of those who want to develop a close personal love for God. So this is the way I present these 5 progressively deeper secrets. There are other schools of thought about how these secrets roll out, but that's a general, I think, a good general understanding of how the progressively deeper and deeper secrets of the Bhagavad Gita are revealed.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. And it sort of dovetails, the fifth secret, I think, was what you were talking about earlier as, I think we just kind of circled around to that again.
Yeah, the fifth secret is revealed in one of the other of the 2 verses that are so important to Krishna that he repeats them. The first instance is at the end of the 9th chapter, which is right in the literary center of the Bhagavad Gita. And one of the rules of hermeneutics, again, is that if you want to know what's important, you look at what the text emphasizes. And one of the ways to understand where the emphasis is to ask, well, what's in the middle? What is right in the center of the text, like a crown jewel, around which the rest of the text revolves, like setting stones that are meant to amplify the beauty of the central stone. So this central verse, the last verse of the 9th chapter, Krishna tells Arjuna to direct your mind toward me, become my devotee, offer your sacrifices to me, and act in reverence for me. And then he says, thus you will surely come to me, having completely absorbed yourself in me alone. So establishing this idea that union in relationship to Krishna ought to be Arjuna's ultimate goal, not necessarily winning on the battlefield, but fighting on the battlefield is his way of cultivating this close relationship with Krishna. Now, when Krishna repeats this same instruction or this same invitation to Arjuna in the 18th chapter, as he's making his very last closing argument, right at the philosophical conclusion of the Gita, he says the same thing: direct your mind toward me, become my devotee, offer your sacrifices to me, and act in reverence to me. But then he changes the second sentence. This time, instead of speaking about you will come to me because you are absorbed in me, he says, thus you will surely come to me. I promise you this because you are so very dear to me. So here, Krishna is revealing his heart. He's telling Arjuna that he loves him and that everything he has said is for his benefit and for the purpose of engaging in a relationship of love with Arjuna. And Arjuna is our role model. So Krishna is speaking to us here. He's revealing his heart. And you only reveal your heart to someone you trust, and you trust the people who love you. So it's a wonderful invitation for us to cultivate a close, trusting, loving relationship with the supreme divinity who is the source of our being and who Krishna describes as he describes that we are actually a part of the absolute reality, and the absolute reality has the attribute of being a person, which is how we derive our own personhood, and therefore a personal relationship with the personal form of absolute reality is the ultimate goal of devotional yoga.
So I'm looking at your wonderful book, and it talks about the different sort of aspects of Krishna, and Hari is one of them, correct? The first
Yes.
part, removal of darkness?
The Hari is a name of Krishna that has many meanings, one of which is the one who removes darkness from the hearts of his devotees.
Okay. So your full name, what does the latter part represent? What are you removing darkness from, perhaps?
There's a very nice verse in the middle of the Bhagavad Gita, one of the 4 central verses, wherein Krishna tells Arjuna, I, dwelling within the hearts of my devotees, remove the darkness of ignorance with the shining lamp of knowledge. So one kind of darkness is avidya, the absence of light, which makes it impossible for us to see the true nature of ourselves, the true nature of reality, etc. But on a more personal level, the darkness within one's heart is the absence of connection, the absence of the experience of love on a spiritual level. And so Krishna removes that kind of darkness from the hearts of his devotees.
Yeah. And so in a way, that's probably the separation between us or the devotees and Krishna, Krishna, perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There are two kinds of separation in the particular form of bhakti yoga that I practice. One is the separation that comes from the covering of material nature that makes it appear as if the supreme divinity, who is by definition everywhere all the time, is not present, that we have the illusion of independence from the complete absolute truth. And then there is a different kind of separation, a longing to be reunited with one's beloved. So in bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion, when we cultivate love to the extent that there is an actual longing to be reunited with our beloved, the supreme divinity, in this case, Krishna, then that kind of separation is actually a kind of spiritual ecstasy.
Wow, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. You had mentioned that you do workshops and for people that are interested, and I think Elizabeth had mentioned mentorship calls and things like that.
Yes, I offer online workshops and courses. I also offer personal spiritual mentorships and small group mentorships for yoga teachers. And primarily, all of this is online, and I have an email that I send out to my subscribers that lets everyone know what I'm doing, but also just shares spiritual knowledge according to my understanding of how it's applied to our lived experience on a regular basis. So people can find me on my website and look on the events page to see what's coming up, and they can also look at the mentorship pages if they're interested in engaging me with in that way.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
For your listeners who are interested in my book, it is available through your locally owned bookstore, through bookshop.org, or you can find it among the usual suspects.
Will do. Thank you very much, Hari. I appreciate this, and I really like the format of this book. And if you haven't read this or read the Gita before, or like me, it's been something you read many, many, many years ago, it's a wonderful way to really take a deep dive into it and dissect it and sort of pull out the interesting parts.
Michael, thank you very much. I very much appreciate your vote of confidence and have enjoyed our conversation very much. Thank you very much for inviting me.